Hey, how you doing? This is RJ. Today I'm going to talk about why you should be afraid of Sana Amanat's job title. Now, for those of you who don't know, and very briefly, Sana Amanat is the second in command at Marvel Comics. And being the second in command at Marvel Comics, she is one of the most, if not the most influential person in comic books today. And her job title is VP of Content and Character Development. Now, when most people hear this, they think it's a made-up job title and that it really doesn't mean anything at all. But on the contrary, its meaning is quite significant. And in order to get to its meaning, first we need to look at what Sana Amanat actually does at Marvel. And we can do that by looking at her own words, because Sana Amanat makes herself readily available for interviews on podcasts and on panels all the time, and she talks about the direction of Marvel and the direction she is pushing Marvel into. And in almost every one of these venues, when she speaks, she talks about representation. Most specifically about representation of women, but she also includes representation of people of color, minorities, and other groups. Now, two of the things that she is invested in heavily at Marvel right now is the Women of Marvel podcast and the Marvel Rising initiative. And I call it an initiative because it has a comic book, it has shorts on the internet, it also has a movie, which is coming out coincidentally tonight on the Disney Channel. Now, in these venues, she always talks about representation. And I would say that the Women of Marvel podcast is talking about representation. It is quite specifically geared towards talking almost exclusively about representation of women. And also it'll include other minorities, such as people of color, if they have a person of color on the broadcast. Because what they do is they interview a woman, and it is someone who usually has something to do with Marvel or something very briefly to do with Marvel, and they only talk about that connection for about 1/3 of the entire podcast, which is usually 30 to 40 minutes long. The other time is taken up by discussing the woman's life and what she has done with her life and her accomplishments. And this is meant to be a representation for women, for people of color, for minorities, etc. And when she talks about Marvel Rising, she also talks about representation of things like body positivity. And when she talks about these things, she is not talking about them in an offhand sort of in the corner way of this is part of what we're doing here. She talks about it as this is extremely important. That is to say, it is one of the key core elements of this whole initiative that they are pushing and have been creating for the last 2 years. Now, when they talk about representation, a normal person would look at it and say, they're talking about representation in terms of they're saying that here we have a woman. We are giving her a platform in order for people to see her, such as the Women of Marvel podcast, so that other women, people of color, etc., can see her doing this and therefore say to themselves, look, someone like me is doing this job, therefore I can do it too. And it talks about it in a number of different ways, not only within the characters within comic books themselves, but also within the company of Marvel itself. And they're talking about it as representation of women in their IT department at times. And they're also talking about it within Disney itself, as they've had people from other Disney corporations come on and do their own thing about representation within the larger company. Now, as I said, when a normal person looks at this, you would say that what they're talking about is simply presenting positive role models for people so that they can see this and actually utilize it in their life as a positive role model. But if you actually look very specifically at the language that she is using and how it is presented, it is quite specifically and undoubtedly simply a presentation of identity politics. Now, whether she knows it or not, I will say, whether she knows it or not, it is a presentation of identity politics. I would say from her use of language and how she ties it so well together, she does know it, and she specifically means it to be a presentation of identity politics, but I'll leave it at whether she knows it or not. Because when you talk about representation, and the only representation that you speak of is of minority groups or women, you are quite specifically talking about identity politics. And that is what she is doing in these avenues, and that is what she is promoting as the core elements of all that she is doing within certainly the Marvel Rising initiative, and it is what this entire podcast is built around. Now, in order to explain to you why this is such a dangerous thing, I'm going to have to explain a little bit of what identity politics is, and then bring it back to Sana Amanat. Now, identity politics is specifically built upon the idea of oppression, and that is to say that if you are anything other than a straight, white, Christian man, then you are someone who is oppressed. And the thing is that these people who are oppressed, they need to gather themselves together in identity groups, in groups specifically built around their identity, and promote from their shared experiences of oppression some kind of movement in order for them to gain specific rights for themselves over and above other identity groups. They are basically weaponizing their identity in order to gain specific rights for themselves that no one else has, in order that they will not be oppressed ever again. Now, here we have, right off the bat, the very basis of identity politics, and it is anti-equality. Because if these groups are specifically looking for special rights for themselves and for no other group, we are looking at a system where there is no equality under the law. We are looking at a system where people are not all equal, because every identity group will have its own specific rights in order to defend itself, and every person in that identity group will specifically have those rights which no one else will have. This is quite specifically anti-equality. And of course, they use these special rights in order to gain power over those people who they see to be oppressors, which are of course the straight white Christian men. And at the same time, if you are anyone, and it does not matter if you're a woman, a person of color, a person of another minority, a person of another religion, if you are any one of these other classes than straight white Christian man that actually says that Western culture and all of the things that built Western culture is actually a good thing, then you are also one of these oppressors, because you have been deceived and you have internalized this oppression to the point where you are now an oppressor. This is where you get the idea of, let's say, internalized misogyny, where you have a woman who doesn't quite specifically hate men. She must have internally accepted the misogyny that has been forced upon her to the extent that she has now become an oppressor. So, identity politics is specifically built upon this idea of oppression and of gaining specific new rights for these identity classes alone, which makes it anti-equality. And at the same time, they have to define what their identity is. And in order to define what their identity is, they define it quite specifically upon their emotions. Not upon reason, but upon their emotions. Because if you look at who or what you are according to reason, you are not looking at your identity, you are looking at your nature. And of course, since you are looking at your nature, you will start looking at something that is common between all peoples, and identity politics ensures that there is anti-equality. It is built upon a premise of anti-equality. You cannot look at the human nature, because that would be something that would promote a standardized equality among everyone, and they cannot have that. They need to have specific special rights for specific classes of people. Therefore, they must look at their identity, and they define their identity quite specifically through emotion. And emotion is a subjective thing, not an objective thing. That is to say, it deals only with the subject. And a statement like "I like ice cream" is a subjective statement. A statement like "gravity exists" is an objective statement because it deals with the thing outside of you which exists in reality. However, they do not wish to deal with any kind of reason at all. It is only based upon emotion. And since it is only based upon emotion, that is to say, subjective ideas, and it discounts objective ideas, it is therefore anti-reason. Now, at the same time, because it is anti-reason, it is also anti-American. Because, of course, when you look at things like the Declaration of Independence that states, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal," etc., etc., we are dealing with things that are both based on reason and deal with equality. And of course, we have already seen that you cannot have equality under a system built by identity politics. There needs to be inequality. And at the same time, a statement like "we find these truths to be self-evident" is a logical statement. Most people who do not study the document thoroughly don't know that this is quite specifically meant to be a logical statement. A self-evident statement is briefly a statement which, if you know the definition of each of the words in the statement according to reality, then that statement's meaning is evident within itself. That is to say, it is self-evident. This is a logical term. And since logic is simply reasoning about reason, and for identity politics you cannot use reason, then, of course, you cannot take this document to mean what it is supposed to mean in any way. Nor, of course, can you use words like truth, which are actually objective norms. Rather, you need to use subjective norms in identity politics. So, in many and various ways, identity politics is anti-American, and that is quite specifically evident just simply by understanding what identity politics is and its narrative of oppressor and oppressed, and how the oppressed must weaponize their identity in order to gain new specific rights for themselves which no one else has. Now, to move back to Sana Amanat. If identity politics is at the heart of these initiatives that Sana Amanat is pushing in Marvel, and you can quite specifically tell from the structure of both the Women of Marvel podcast and what she is stating about Marvel Rising, and you could throw in on top of that the anti-white sentiments of which she expressed in her Fast Company interview, then you can see that she is quite specifically using identity politics when she talks about representation. And if she is using identity politics, and identity politics is at the core of all that she is presenting at Marvel, and she is the person who controls the character development and content of all the books at Marvel, then she is promoting not only within the content of all of the books, but also in how each and every character develops a anti-American, anti-rational, anti-equality sentiment. And if you happen to be someone like us here at Comicsgate, and it does not matter if, again, you are a person of color, or a woman, or someone of another minority status, it does not matter. If you wish to actually read comic books and say, "But I am also a patriotic American," then you are an oppressor. And if you wish to say that "I only wish the best for comics, we should sit down and have a rational discussion about what is the best for comics," you are an oppressor. And if you wish to say that "in my comics, I wish to see equalities of all people, not just within the characters, but within the people who create them," then you are an oppressor. And since you are an oppressor, you can be treated with malice. Not only with malice, but also you, as an oppressor, do not deserve the rights under which you live. And therefore, in the eyes of someone who is actually following identity politics, you can be attacked both verbally, and physically. Welcome to the brave new world of the 21st century. Alright, as always, if I gave you anything new to think about, hit like. Hit the shield in the lower right hand corner of your screen to subscribe, and leave me a comment. Give me something new to think about. Alright, I'll see you later. Bye.